Thank you for downloading the Witness History podcast with me, Kurt Brooks. Today I'm taking you back to 1996, when the release of a new video game would launch one of the highest grossing media franchises of all time. I've been speaking to developer Akihito Tomisawa about the release of Pokemon.
It
was unpredicted. I never expected it to be so popular around the world. I thought it might be released outside Japan, but I didn't expect it to be a worldwide hit.
On
the 27th of February 1996, Pocket Monsters Red and Pocket Monsters Green were released in Japan on Nintendo's Game Boy console. Inspired by creator Satoshi Tajiri's childhood hobby of collecting insects, players were tasked with collecting a variety of creatures, training them, and then do battle against other trainers. These creatures were called Pocket Monsters. Over time, the words Pocket and Monsters were combined to what we refer to them today as Pokemon. But in those early days, the project went by a different name.
The first time I heard about Pokemon was when I was working for Game Freak. The president of the company showed me a presentation that he'd made for the games. At the time, it wasn't called Pocket Monsters, it was called Capsule Monsters. The first time I saw it, I thought, wow, this is going to sell a lot of copies. I thought this because the players needed 2 Game Boy consoles and a link cable to exchange the monsters with their friends. So I thought, it's going to make a lot of money.
The Game Boy had been out for a while by now though, hadn't it?
Just before the game was released, I was working for Sony. I was telling my colleagues that Game Freak would soon release Pokemon, and that I thought it would sell over 1 million copies and become a bestseller. But all my colleagues at Sony laughed at me and said it wasn't possible because the Game Boy was so old. But I was right. It sold millions and millions of copies.
They weren't an instant smash hit, partly due to the age of the Game Boy, which was released in 1989. But it was later that Pokemon would make a huge impact, as it made the leap from a 2.5-inch monochrome screen to colourful television animation.
I had left about 2 years before it was released, but I knew it would do well. I was proud to tell people I'd worked on it and that it would be really popular. In 1996, when Pokemon was first released, many people thought that the Game Boy was coming to the end of its life and considered it out of date. When it was first released, there wasn't a sensational response, but it steadily increased, and within 6 months, it was very popular. But then, the anime debuted on TV and made it even more popular.
What was it like when the anime was first broadcast?
I went to Game Freak and watched it with some of my old colleagues. Everybody was so excited because for the first time we could see the world we had created through the medium of television. It was so exciting to see the main character, Satoshi, shout the famous phrase, "I choose you." This phrase was first used on TV.
But as Pokemon was taking off in its homeland, the first time anyone outside Japan would hear about the franchise would be in December 1997, and it was for all the wrong reasons.
An investigation's underway in Japan into why more than 600 children suffered from convulsions and vomiting after watching a television cartoon programme. It's thought that bright flashing lights in the cartoon, Pocket Monsters, were to blame. Andrew Burrows reports.
Almost every Japanese child knows Pocket Monsters and its star Pakucho. They play the Nintendo computer game. Millions were glued to the latest cartoon episode when a flashing explosion triggered convulsions in hundreds of children. Many were kept in hospital for over 24 hours. Often those affected had no history of epilepsy.
Everyone at Game Freak was very sad, even though it wasn't their fault. I remember the newspaper headlines said, "Pikachu attacks children." But the mass media likes to exaggerate things like this.
But despite this hiccup, Pokemon went on to be released around the world. Sometimes game developers make changes to Japanese games to appeal to the international market, But Akihito said game producer Sunikazu Ishihara wanted to take a different approach.
あの頃って、ポケモンが世に
I didn't expect it to be such a big hit abroad. At the time, it was difficult to bring a Japanese product overseas because there's a difference in tastes between Japan and the rest of the world, so it's necessary to localize for other countries' tastes. One of the first games we made at Game Freak was called Quinty, and we had to make changes for the overseas market, like changing the name and bits of the storyline. But with Pokemon, we didn't change anything. Mr. Ishihara, one of the producers of Pokemon, decided that things would be uniform. The games would have the same names and the same design. His decision was right.
ポケモンは、タイトルもポケモンのまんまですしね。
The international versions, known as Pokemon Red and Pokemon Blue, sold over 30 million copies and caught the world's attention. Now there seemingly isn't any part of the media Pokemon hasn't infiltrated. From comics and trading cards, to mobile games and a theme park. There was even a live-action film with Hollywood actor Ryan Reynolds playing Pikachu, arguably the series' most popular character. Now the second highest grossing media franchise in history, surpassing pop culture icons like Barbie, Batman and even Mickey Mouse, Akihito says the success comes from very humble beginnings.
どう言ったらいいのかな。ゲームって
When Game Freak started, there were only 3 full-time employees, including the president. When I started there a few years later, there were only 7 employees, including the president. And when Pokemon released, there were only 15 employees, including the CEO. Since the first release, the Pokemon brand has gotten bigger and bigger, and now they have around 50 to 70 full-time employees. So the scale of the company has gotten much bigger. But thanks to Pokemon, they are thriving
そういう
now.
心配はないと思いますけどね。
You said that you left before the games were released, but Pokemon was still part of your life, wasn't it?
一番最初の
After the first games were released, I wrote a book about how to play the game well. After Pokemon was released, I became an independent writer, and thanks to Pokemon, I got lots of jobs. I wrote a book and lots of articles about Pokemon and my colleagues at Game Freak. This was all thanks to
仕事
Pokemon.
は増えましたよね。その頃ね。だからしばらくフリーランス
I
の
went
仕
back to
事
Game Freak a couple of years later and asked if I could work with them again. And they told me I could be the scenario writer for the next release, which was Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire.
ルビーサファイアのメインシナリオライターを務めました。
Now retired as a developer and working as a freelance writer, Akihito looks back fondly on his time working on the series.
ただひたすら毎日面白かったんです
Every
よ。
day I was so excited. Every day I never got bored because the creator of Pokemon, Satoshi Tajiri, was such a genius. I was so lucky to work with such a genius person, sitting next to him every day. I never got bored. I was always excited.
もう面白くて仕方なかったですよ。
But what about the Pokemon themselves? 151 were originally designed, but over 1,000 have been created since that first release in 1996. All fans have a favourite Pokemon, but which is yours?
僕が好きなポケモン、ニョロゾです。
Nyorozo is my favourite Pokemon. All Game Freak employees have a business card that includes their favourite Pokemon character. So mine had Nyorozo on it. He's like a tadpole. He has a circle inside his tummy. He's so cute.
中にぐるぐるの渦巻きが書いてあって可愛いんですよ。
Mine's Psyduck. Pokemon developer Akihito Tomisawa was speaking to me, Kurt Brooks. Thank you for downloading this edition of the Witness History Podcast. It was a Made in Manchester production for the BBC World Service.